Long live the king, shouted the man as he lurched towards King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, holding a bouquet. Fingers curled around the flowers, the contract killer and revolutionary Vlado Chernozemski, known to his friends as Vlada the chauffeur, pressed the finger of his semi-automatic pistol, firing 10 shots that killed the king and France's foreign minister. For the first time in history, by the way, that summer, a cameraman was on hand to record the assassination live. French investigators soon determined that the killers had been trained at secret camps in Hungary and frequently telephoned Ante Pavelic, the head of the fascist Ustase organization. The Ustasha was known to be harbored by Italy, where it was training insurgents it hoped would one day take over Croatia. The killer was never brought to trial. The great historian of terrorism, Walter Lecker, has recorded that the man who ordered the killing, fascist Italy's ruler Benito Mussolini, attended a memorial for Alexander I in Rome in full ceremonial uniform, shedding bitter tears for the man he'd ordered killed. Even though the world knew what had happened, it did nothing. And there's some important lessons there for what's happening between India and Pakistan. Last week, Pakistan charged India with organizing the assassination of Shahid Latif, slain in Sialkot last year, and Muhammad Riaz. Even by the standards of a country that has failed to prosecute the perpetrators of the 26/11 Mumbai attacks and dozens of other terrorist attacks in India, the hypocrisy was particularly rank. Islamabad chose not to mention that the two men have long faced serious terrorism charges in India and have been operating from safe havens in Pakistan with the protection of its intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI. Latif, who was released from an Indian prison in 2010, was charged with India of organizing the 2016 attack on an Air Force base in Pathankot. But he was never investigated by Pakistan, let alone tried or handed over to India. Riaz, originally an Indian national who fled across the line of control, actually received a hero's burial in public at the Lashkar-e-Taiba's headquarters near Lahore, a facility which is, just to add to the irony, ostensibly run by the government of Pakistan. Though India's intelligence services are reputed to have carried out at least 16 assassinations of wanted terrorists through 2023, the Indian government has consistently denied its involvement for a number of reasons which were illustrated in that post-First World War assassination I told you about. The time might have come to reconsider this silence, but also to bring greater accountability and oversight to India's overt killings. As the case of Alexander I reminds us, the problem of state-sponsored terrorism was not born in recent years. Like Yugoslavia in 1934, India has often been pressured by global powers to refrain from military retaliation against terrorism because of fears of a regional war. The crisis that followed the attack on Parliament House in 2000 and Bombay in 2008 are just the most egregious examples. The strategic imperative of cultivating Pakistan during the 9/11 wars gave Pakistan protection from the United States even as it used terrorism against India. French newspapers were indiscreetly leaned on to hush up Mussolini's role in Alexander I's killing. I have telephoned the editors of your respective papers, said France's new foreign minister Pierre Laval, who thought coddling Germany was a good thing, to impress upon them the grave danger of war as a result of the assassination. Listen, young fellow, Laval told one particularly pesky reporter, you don't want to die for Yugoslavian honor, do you? There has long been suspicion among historians that Laval was even willing to countenance Mussolini's genocidal war on Ethiopia, which involved the use of poison gas against unarmed civilians, just in return for avoiding a war that would drag France into conflict with Germany. The execution of Laval in 1945 as a German collaborator and Mussolini's near simultaneous lynching by partisans in Italy left unresolved a long series of questions about this issue. Even as nationalists, left wing revolutionaries, and anarchists targeted European states with terrorism before 1914, historian Mary Barton has observed, state sponsored terrorism became a major concern in the interwar period. The so called revisionist powers, that's Hungary, Austria, and Bulgaria, opposed the post war settlement. Since they couldn't fight back against it militarily, they used proxies to secure their territorial and political ambitions. Italy and Germany, the two losing powers, provided cover to these smaller revisionist powers. The assassination of Alexander I was just one of many similar killings. Romanian Prime Minister Ion Duceac was killed by a fascist Iron Guard terrorist in December 1933, and the Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was murdered by Nazis in July 1934. The League of Nations proposed two treaties in 1937 to address the problem of terrorism, but only British ruled India, which attended that conference as a separate entity from Britain, eventually ratified it. As Barton's path-breaking work makes clear, British India at the time feared the impact of small arms proliferation left behind by the Second World War. In a 1917 memorandum, Colonel Sykes, famous for the Sykes-Picot agreement that partitioned Syria and Lebanon, pointed to the general problem of these arms falling into the hands of what he called inferior races. There were enough weapons, he pointed out, to arm every black man who wanted a rifle. Even though anti-colonial uprisings after the Second World War seemed to bear out Sykes' warning, the West wasn't ready to go to war yet. Following the Second World War, political scientist Brian Jenkins warns that a growing number of governments saw terrorism as, I quote, a cheap means of engaging in war against domestic foes or other nations. Terrorism had a lot of advantages. It was deniable, it minimized the risks of outright conflict, and through the sunset of the age of empire and the rise of the Cold War, terrorism was liberally used by revolutionaries and by nation states, including the United States. The term targeted killing, scholar Uri Friedman reminds us, wasn't invented by terrorists, but by human rights organizations to describe the murder of non-combatants by military forces and death squads in the country of El Salvador, which was sponsored by the United States. Even though the 1980s saw growing public concern over the threat of terrorism, governments remained loath to seriously act against it. In part, historian Walter Lecker tells us, because it claimed relatively few lives in the West. Terrorism proved pretty easy to suppress where governments were not squeamish over using savagery. Turkey, Iran, and Argentina, for example, ruthlessly crushed terrorism with death squads. The United Kingdom even, not infrequently, used death squads to wipe out its enemies in Northern Ireland. Following the 9/11 attacks in the United States, though, everything changed. The norms governing the way the world fought terrorism and used it underwent radical revision. Killing to prevent, I'll repeat that sentence just in case it got wiped out. Following the September 11 attacks in the United States, though, the norms related to fighting terrorism underwent radical revision. Killing to preempt terrorist violence became acceptable as a form of self-defense, the former intelligence officer Thomas Hunter notes. The political executive in the United States, drawing from earlier experience in Israel, asserted the right to kill when perpetrators and potential perpetrators were beyond the reach of its legal system. Successive US presidents signed off on the execution of terrorists when violence was imminent. The risks of such operations, though, are not trivial. The first attack on an Al-Qaeda training camp in Yemen, authorized by President Barack Obama, law scholar Paradis Karabey reminds us, ended up claiming the lives of 41 people from two families, half of whom were children under 15. The attack was just one of dozens which claimed civilian lives. These kinds of attacks give terrorists the halo of martyrdom. But the so-called collateral costs of targeted killing aren't the only reason for greater accountability. The potential misuse of executive authority to exercise lethal force is self-evident. Lawyer Benjamin McKelvey, among others, has argued that targeted killing for all practical purposes extinguishes the legal rights of suspects. After all, there's no trial or defense lawyer, just the decision of a political leader. As important, killing perpetrators doesn't seem to actually solve the problem. Terrorists in Kashmir, for example, have responded to India's alleged assassinations in Pakistan with multiple ambushes of Indian troops. This lures India into precisely the kind of military escalation on the line of control that targeted killing is intended to avoid in the first place. Think of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or the Islamic State. They've all been subjected to targeted attacks. They're all still around. Indeed, organizations like Hamas have flourished in the face of targeted killings by Israel. Fighting terrorism needs nuanced political and social actions, not just killing. The rage Indians feel at Pakistan's long-standing policy of providing safe havens for terror is deep and is also legitimate. The government's new resolve to end the impunity for terror Islamabad has given, though, also needs new instruments to regulate its power and safeguard against abuse. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you for watching Security Code.